Hello! In this tutorial we're going to talk about cameras. Cameras can be a very powerful tool if you want to manipulate how the player perceives your age and perhaps help him with the solution of a puzzle by pointing the camera at a certain thing. So in this tutorial we're going to talk about how to set up cameras for the plasma engine, what different types of cameras there are, and about transitions from one camera into another. We're not going to talk about animated cameras, that will be part of another tutorial. We should always have a look at what Cyan did because they are the masters. In this case I've loaded up the Relto Age and you can see the default camera here is this behind the shoulder camera that automatically rotates and follows the avatar, and it is set very low above the ground so that you have a nice sense for the scale of the age. If we move now towards these pillars, notice what happens to the camera. It zooms in a little bit closer behind the avatar. This now gives you the sense that the region you're in is a little bit more important, and still it is this follow camera that rotates around, and if you exit this region again, the camera will jump back to its default position. Let's now have a look at another type of camera. If we move towards this path, the camera will swing over away from the typical perspective here to an outside point of view, and it seems to be fixed in its position, however it still follows the avatar around when it moves. And as soon as we exit this region, the camera swings back behind our shoulder. So this was another type of camera. That was not a follow camera, but it was a fixed camera. And just one more example of a fixed camera is if I enter this region in front of the hut here. As you can see, the camera swings over to a fixed position, and I guess Cyan did that to prevent the player being blocked behind this wall. However, if we were to walk over here, we were then blocked by this wall. That's why Cyan established yet another shot for this entrance, and this will be triggered in just a moment. Here, as you can see, there is another fixed camera looking at the right side of the stairs, and depending on where you stand on the stairs, you either get the right view or the left view. Up until now we have only seen smooth transitions between cameras. This will change when we now enter the hut. You can see there is a hard cut to the camera inside the building. And if I run around the hut here, you can see yet another type of camera, and that is a so-called circle camera. This is very nice, especially for interiors. It always stays at the other end of the room and follows the player along nicely and gives you an overview over the room, and the player is also in the shot. Also, one last tiny little detail: if you right click and hold down the right mouse button, the player is able to manipulate this view somewhat. I don't have the complete freedom of movement, but in a certain region I can move the camera, and as soon as I move again, the camera readjusts to its normal position. So that was the little example from Cyan. Let's now have a look at how to set this up in 3D Studio Max. I have recreated Relto here beautifully, as I'd say. And I've also set up all the camera objects and the camera regions that will trigger the cameras just to save some time. However, where are they? Well, a little workflow tip here. Things get very crowded and very complicated during age creation because there are just so many things: the dummies, the proxies, all the geometry, the animated objects. To sort these assets, two things are important. One, a good naming convention. You should really think about prefixes or suffixes to all your objects so that you can sort them quickly, and when you bring up the object selection dialog by hitting H, you should have them in a nice list here. And as you can see, I wasn't very good at naming my objects. By the way, I should also point out that you can find this scene, this 3D Studio Max file, in the comments section of this video, so you can download it and have a look at all the final setups and also test it if you want. So, the second thing that helps you organize your scene is the so-called layer manager. And this is up here, these 3 sheets of paper. If you click on that, this brings up all the different layers that you have for your scene. In this case, I've set up a scene called cameras, where all the objects that are concerned with cameras are in, and then you can click this little icon here to hide and unhide all the objects in this layer. So to To get objects into a layer, you just select them and then you click this button here which says create new layer containing selected objects, and later you can of course come here and pick certain objects and cut them out of one layer and paste them into another layer. So this is very nice and saves you from lots of organizing issues. I've also color-coded these different camera regions and the cameras that they trigger. Before we start here, let me first show you how you create a camera in 3D Studio Max. You go to the Create panel up here, and then you switch to this camera icon and click on Target. The Plasma engine likes target cameras, don't use free cameras. Then you click and drag somewhere in the viewport, and what pops out of the camera is the target of the camera, so where does the camera look at, and if you release the mouse button, then you have your camera set up completely, and you can move the camera independently and the target as well. We can keep that in mind because later on the Plasma engine also talks about two values here, the position for the camera and the position of the POA. That's what it's called in the Plasma engine, the point of attention. So where does the camera look at? How to trigger a camera? Just set up a simple object. It should be as simple as a box or a cylinder, because the only type of collision checking for these camera regions is hull. So if you use complex shapes like an L, they won't get correct results because the collision is just too complicated. If you want shapes like an L, you would have to copy one of the camera regions and move it around so to cover the region that you want. Then to this object you assign a component, new camera region. If you assign this component, the box will automatically be hidden in the engine, so you don't need to worry about that, and as soon as the player enters this box, it will switch to the camera that you specify in the properties of the camera region component. In this case I chose to switch to the cam fixed 1, which is this purple camera here. This camera will then stay the active camera as long as the player is inside this region, and if you then move out of this region, the engine will automatically switch to the camera that was active before this one. And we'll talk about this active camera business in just a moment. You want this, if you remember, to be a fixed camera. This position can't change, however you want the target of the camera to follow the avatar around. First you have to tell the engine that this is a fixed camera. To do that you assign a component to the camera object, not to the camera region but to the camera object, and that is new camera, fixed camera. This doesn't have any properties, you just assign it to the camera object so that the Plasma engine knows what it's all about. If you just use a fixed camera component on your camera, the camera will be absolutely static. It will always look in the direction of the target that you've set up here in Max, and the player can run around even out of the shot, the camera won't move. In this case, we want the target of the camera to follow the avatar. To do that, we'll assign another component to the camera, and this is a new camera avatar point of attention. So we want the camera to focus on the avatar. You could also choose object point of attention if you want the camera to focus on an object. In this case I chose avatar point of attention, and here you have to set up the offset at which part of the avatar the camera looks at, and I strongly advise you to use these values 006, because this way the camera will look at the head of the avatar and not at, well, his lower parts or somewhere else, and don't use offset in world space because that gives strange results. Let's have a look at another type of camera, and that is the circle camera that moves inside this room here. To set up a camera as a circle camera, you need to attach to it a component, new camera, circle camera, and in the properties of this component you just set the speed of the camera, especially this one here. You should push this a little bit over the default value of 0.1, because otherwise the avatar is able to run so fast that the camera loses him from the shot. Also I would check go to farthest point, because that assures that the camera stays always at the other end of the room. And finally, if you remember, we were able to control the panning of this camera a little bit. To do that, just assign another component to this camera, and that is new camera, allow camera panning. You could in theory also allow camera zoom, however people often don't even know the keyboard shortcuts of how to do the camera zoom. That's why I wouldn't advise to do that, but camera panning you can add that. I just set it up to allow up and down and left and right panning 15 degrees each. In the next part of the tutorial we'll look at auto cameras, so cameras that move behind the avatar, and transitions between cameras. I will also show you a way of how to force the player into third-person mode if he only uses the first-person camera.